Hey everyone, so this is a video lecture to kind of make up for the fact that I am out of town at a conference. So this would have been the kind of in-class discussion of Berlin and Dahl that we would have had on April 12th, but I'm out of town. So I put together this video lecture. It will deal with some of the themes in this week's reading in kind of a condensed form, some of the areas in which we would normally have class discussion. I'll just ask you to think about on your own and kind of go through some of the major points of a couple of different perspectives on pluralist democracy. So what we'll cover in this video lecture, first we'll talk about value pluralism versus political pluralism. They're kind of different concepts. Pluralism is one of those tricky words that you've probably all heard the word pluralism used or pluralist used in various contexts. And once you kind of dig into that term and how it's used in everyday discourse, but also in political science, you realize that there are some pretty significant distinctions. So really a lot of this discussion, this video, will be focused on recognizing those different distinctions and kind of grappling with the different perspectives on what pluralism means. So you've read this short piece by Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin is a good example of what we call value pluralism. He's really dealing with it on the side of values. You've also read this piece by Robert Dahl. Robert Dahl he passed away recently, but was a huge figure in political science articulating what we mean by political pluralism. And so we'll talk about what that means and how specifically he's defining it. And then we'll talk about the implications of this view for democracy, some of the criticisms, some of the fears associated with Dahl's conception of pluralism and pluralism generally. So to start, I want you to think about at the most basic level how you would define pluralism. When you think of pluralism in everyday conversation, you hear pluralism referenced in the media or at your university, right? What do we mean by pluralist? And in particular, sometimes you'll hear people talk about pluralism and relativism, right? So think about that for a minute, maybe even pause the video and do some basic kind of word association with pluralism. Now, the context in which we tend to use pluralism in everyday society, if that concept or that term came up in a conversation that you were having, especially in the United States, usually we're talking about culture, religion, race, right? In that sense, pluralism means a plurality, a variety of different perspectives, kind of coexisting and having some sort of commonality, even in the face of that difference, right? So a pluralist society, oftentimes people say that pluralism is under attack, and there's this attempt to kind of push through, either from the political left or from the political right, some singular conception of what the proper set of ideas, the proper identities are. And that's really at odds with this American tradition of different traditions, different ideas, different identities, commingling, that idea of the melting pot, right? So oftentimes this is used in kind of a general cultural sense. We're talking about pluralism. Relativism, that's a concept that comes up in relation to culture as well. Sometimes you'll hear about cultural relativism. So the idea with cultural relativism is that there are so many different ideas and identities and cultural identities, cultural representations of what is right and what is wrong, how people ought to behave. And from outside those cultural perspectives, from outside those cultural environments, we really can't understand those views. So relativism refers to a kind of a hesitancy to judge, a feeling of lacking the legitimacy to engage in judgment of another worldview, another identity, another culture from outside that culture, right? So in the Middle East, for example, there's all of these practices and tendencies associated with a very, very different cultural environment than we have in the United States. And some people look at that and say, you know, no, absolutely, there shouldn't be these sorts of practices. We know based on what is right and wrong that we must judge these things. We must call out these behaviors, these practices. Whereas others will say, yeah, you know about those things from a very Western, very individualistic point of view, oftentimes a very secular point of view. Many of the cultural practices in the Middle East are driven by Islam and religion, and there's not this division between politics and public life and religion that we have in the United States. So can you really critique those things? Can you really look at those practices and say that they're wrong or they're should be reformed or amended in some way? So a lot of the conversations that we have about pluralism, especially in the United States, refer in some way to different identities and different cultures. There's some of that in the different conceptions of pluralism that we talk about today. But the key thing to understand is that pluralism has multiple meanings, even within political theory. So both Berlin and Dahl, we're talking about them in the context of political theory, but they have very, very different conceptions of pluralism. And it's not just that they disagree, it's that they're using pluralism to mean different things. Okay, so it's not even a disagreement or a divergence in terms of how they think we ought to deal with pluralism. They are literally talking about different things. Okay, so Berlin, who we're going to talk about first, is really discussing what we call value pluralism, right? So value pluralism is more philosophical, it's more conceptual, it refers to the inherent in Berlin's view, just it is part of the substance of human beings, inherent human diversity in terms of ideals and worldviews. He doesn't think that it's infinite, and he says that in this piece. He says that not everyone is an island unto themselves. Not everyone is this distinctive snowflake with their own conceptions of how we look at the world and we understand the world. So it's not endless, but there are, in his view, significant and irreconcilable, meaning there's no way to arrive at some sort of consensus, irreconcilable differences in relation to how we understand the world, right? So, if you think even in terms of ideas that we've discussed in this class, if you are a individualistic free market conservative, you are going to view the world in one way. If you are a more communally oriented left-wing democratic socialist, you are going to view the world in another way. And Berlin thinks it is a tremendous waste of time to try and smash those viewpoints together until we arrive at some sort of consensus, some sort of third way in between them. We recognize that there are significant and irreconcilable differences there, and we start to think about how those values can coexist. Okay, that's just one example, but there are many in Berlin's view. So it's philosophical, it's conceptual, it relates to how we view and how we understand the world. Dahl is talking about political pluralism, and it's very different. Hopefully you got the sense as you were reading the pieces that his is a more institutional understanding of pluralism. Dahl is presenting us with a framework, and it's a framework for trying to make sense of how different interests, what Madison would call factions, different organized groups within a political system, generate policy outcomes through political institutions. So there are going to be a plurality of organized interests within any given society. How do they interact with one another? How do they get together in some way to arrive at policy outcomes through the mechanism of political institutions? So those are the two things that we're talking about. One is conceptual, one is philosophical. It relates to ideals, it relates to worldview. The other relates to institutional frameworks, how we channel interests through institutional frameworks into policy outcomes. Okay. I don't want to belabor that distinction, but it is a key distinction. If you view Berlin and Dahl talking about exactly the same thing, then there'll be misunderstanding there. So recognize that they're using some of the same terminology, but they're talking about very different things. Okay, so why don't we turn first to Isaiah Berlin? That's a not so flattering picture of Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin was a political philosopher. He was originally from Eastern Europe. He was one of many political philosophers and intellectuals that had to flee Europe, at least Eastern and Central Europe, as the Nazis came into power. And he ended up in Britain. He had a pronounced kind of accent, and it was interesting because his accent when he spoke in English was this mixture of kind of his European roots and then this very proper British accent, and he spoke very quickly. So he was like many of the thinkers that we read at this point in the class, he was exposed to contemporary world events during his time period that I think reinforced for him the centrality of getting the ideas right. In a world in which democracy and fascism were in direct contest with one another, direct conflict and clashing with one another, at this point militarily, I think he and others understood the importance of, for them, liberal democratic values and really kind of delving into why we believe what we believe about human freedom and individual rights and individual liberties. He is definitely within the liberal democratic camp. If you think of the two overarching frameworks for thinking about democracy that we laid out at the beginning of the class, he is definitely framing a liberal democratic worldview. He wrote probably one of the most famous pieces about liberty called Two Concepts of Liberty, in which he made this distinction between negative freedom and positive freedom. And he comes out on the side of negative freedom, the idea that the government's role is to kind of restrict things which would infringe upon individual freedom, not necessarily to create the conditions under which human beings can flourish. He's a little bit skeptical of government taking on those larger roles and involving itself in people's lives to too extensive a degree. So he's in the liberal democratic framework, and he can really be read through that lens. He's brilliant. Isaiah Berlin is brilliant. He actually worked for the British government during the war. He was involved in the war effort, and particularly the intelligence effort. He was providing intelligence about the Nazis and the larger war effort, and he was analyzing that intelligence for the British government. So he obviously understands the importance, the stakes of these larger philosophical debates that he's engaged in, like many of the thinkers at the time. There's a quote from Isaiah Berlin that I think lays out what he's doing in this piece, which incidentally he wrote very late in his life. It's one of the last things that went to print before he died, and he lived a long time. He lived into the 1990s. He says, "There is a plurality of ideals as there is a plurality of cultures and temperaments. Each of us, with his own values, cannot be overcome or integrated. If a man pursues one of these values, I, who do not, am able to understand why he pursues it, or what it would be like for me to be induced to pursue it. Hence the possibility of human understanding." Right? So there are a variety of different ideals about the way that the world ought to work. And we can recognize those differences in others, and we can understand even why someone might be induced to pursue those values, right? So even if we disagree with someone fundamentally, if someone perhaps has a worldview that we find repugnant, they believe in racial inferiority, or they believe in fascism or some sort of authoritarian worldview that we find repugnant, we can understand why they might be induced to pursue it. And this creates the possibility of human understanding, that ability to understand why someone would believe something, even if it's different than what you believe. Pluralism in modern societies, right? That's really what he's grappling with, is how do we deal with different worldviews in the context of a modern society in which we're going to have to live together and make collective decisions, even in the face of different values and different value systems. First off, we have to recognize that, right? He's deeply critical of the tendency, even within liberal democratic societies, for individuals to think that those who hold different values and see a different world, a different ideal in front of them, that they're just mistaken, and they can be cajoled, convinced, compelled to believe in the quote-unquote right set of values. That Berlin thinks is, one, a waste of time, is probably going to be unsuccessful, and two, it also kind of demeans the value of others' understandings. He really believes that diversity, even on value issues, can be productive, a good, positive force in society. And so he says, this is laying out how we exist in this modern condition with different values and different value systems. He says, with imagination, I can enter into a value system which is not my own, but which is nevertheless something I can conceive of men pursuing while remaining human, while remaining creatures with whom I can communicate, right? So an individual holds a value system different than yours, perhaps radically different than yours. If you enter into that value system, if you kind of temporarily occupy that value system, project yourself into another's experience, and imagine what confluence of conditions would drive someone to believe that that is the ideal, to kind of view the world in that way. It enables that other person to retain their humanity. Dehumanization, particularly when we have deep disagreements within society, is always a threat. Berlin saw that in his own experience. He saw Western Europe become a place where those who didn't agree, those who did not fit into the dominant view, the dominant set of values, were cast as inhuman and were politically persecuted on that basis. And so pluralism for Berlin is really about empathy. It is the impulse which drives empathy. Empathy traditionally defined as a combination of intellect and projection and understanding. So we have to use our rational mind to project ourselves into the experience of another, and then to grapple with their own experience to try to understand what their lives are like, right? So intellect, projection, and understanding. Pluralism is what drives us to do that, right? So we have to imagine what it would be like to hold a competing value system. The danger, if we don't, as I said, is that we dehumanize those who hold competing values. They become just these entities that we can't understand what would motivate them to behave that way. And the real danger there is that once we create kind of a hierarchy of varying degrees of humanity, we can begin to justify all sorts of terrible actions, right? So this is one of the big concerns in contemporary politics, is that we've become so divided, and it's the political spectrum and situation, the ideological kind of landscape in the United States has become so extremely polarized that individuals who don't hold the same values as us become kind of lesser tier humans, right? And Berlin was really, really nervous about that process, because once someone is kind of on a lower rung of humanity than you can begin to justify all sorts of terrible actions against them. They are no longer deserving of the same respect and dignity and rights and formal, legal, and political protections that you enjoy. So this is really key. I mean, this is how we maintain a society and we maintain a political system in which individuals can participate without, fear of retribution or persecution. It's essential for the liberal democratic process. It begins with a kind of enthusiastic attitude towards value pluralism. So what I'll ask you to do at this point is just think about some value systems, examples of value systems. If we were in class, this would be a conversation, but maybe pause the video and write down some examples of value systems, either in political life or just generally. So the value systems that Berlin would have been talking about would be liberal political systems versus illiberal political systems. Much of his writing occurred during the Cold War, and so we were talking about the confrontation between a liberal democratic worldview, largely represented by the West, and a more authoritarian, centralized, command economy, state socialist view represented by the East, represented by the Soviet Union and other Soviet satellite states. That, I think, is really the value system clash that drove a lot of the thinking in the 20th century. But this extends even to contemporary society. Really, conservative versus liberal, those are different value systems. You look at the world, you interpret and analyze the world in different ways. Socially open versus more socially closed, receptive to new ideas and new identities versus kind of pushing those ideas and identities back and referring to tradition. These are the sorts of things that Berlin is talking about. What he really wants to see, what he hopes we can achieve in our political practice, is a system in which different sets of values, different viewpoints, different worldviews don't prevent us from engaging with one another politically. Okay. The alternative to this, and probably the dominant way of thinking about diversity in values that we have seen for much of human history, is something called monism, right? Monism is certainly, if you go back to ancient societies, right? Even if you look at some more authoritarian, more communally oriented societies today, there is in some societies a belief that lack of singularity, lack of a single unifying worldview is a threat and is something which should be resisted either in subtle ways or sometimes in extremely violent and extremely repressive ways. Monism just refers to the ancient belief that there's a single harmony of truths into which everything, if it is genuine, in the end must fit. That's a quote from Berlin. So the idea then is that there is some underlying order, some underlying harmony into which all of the different perspectives, all of the different views that exist can fit, if it is genuine, right? So if there is diversity in opinions, that would imply, from a monist perspective, that those are somehow illegitimate ideas. Those are somehow not genuine, not authoritative ideas. And the goal really is to find that singular set of ideas. And we encounter this to a certain extent, probably in things you've encountered before. A lot of people point out Plato's Republic as the example of kind of a monist view. They really believed that there was a singular conception of justice, and that they could, simply by kind of thinking about it and reasoning about it, they could uncover that harmony of truths, that perfect society into which everything would fit. But that really is kind of the complete alternative to value pluralism. And from Berlin's perspective, that's not, monism is an extremely dangerous way of thinking about values for modern societies in which there inherently is going to be lots of diversity and lots of difference of opinion. Um, Value pluralism for Berlin, he's very specific about what it is not. One, it doesn't mean harmony, right? So um, simply finding a way in which we can recognize that we have differences of opinion and try to understand why those differences of opinion exist and cultivate respect for individuals who don't think like us does not mean that society is harmonious. It does not mean that society has moved beyond conflict. We will still have conflict, right? We will still have clashes over different views. But hopefully, those clashes will be intellectual, they'll be respectful, they'll be civil, they won't be violent, as in physical violence clashes, right? It also doesn't mean relativism, that idea that I brought out at the beginning. I.e., according to Berlin, relativism meaning the notion that we hold all different views, which are equally that we all hold different views which are equally valid and deserving of respect. He uses, the example of genocide. Because we respect that there is value pluralism and we try to empathize as to why value pluralism might exist, does not mean that we accept views which we hold repugnant. He says, well, you like your coffee with cream and I like mine with milk, and you like genocide and I don't, and that's all fine. That's not what he's saying. He says that, kind of, it's a little bit snarky the way he presents that. So we still retain the ability to judge. We still retain the ability to judge quite harshly views that we don't agree with, but we try to understand why an individual might feel that way and how, through socialization, through their own intellectual trajectory, they ended up at a position in which they can hold such radically different views than us. Okay. Pluralism also doesn't mean infinite difference. He says you think of any issue, you think of capital punishment or the role of the state in the economy, whatever it might be, you are going to find lots of difference, lots of different opinions, different perspectives on whether or not something should exist or not exist, how it looks in practice, but you're not going to find an infinite number of perspectives and value systems. You'll find some limited number, right? So it doesn't mean that everyone is distinct and unique in their viewpoint. There will be lots and lots of commonality, and then probably a few fringe positions, but it's not infinite. And pluralism also doesn't mean that all political values deserve representation, right? It doesn't mean that we have to somehow make room in the institutions, the political institutions, for every political worldview, every philosophical worldview. There are going to have to be people who get shut out. There are going to be people whose views and perspectives on the world are so narrow and so not widely held across the rest of society that they don't get some sort of formal representation. So pluralism, value pluralism, doesn't mean that we have to kind of make room for everyone. All right, so now we're going to shift gears to talk about Dahl's conception of political pluralism. Robert Dahl, as I mentioned, he's a huge, huge figure in political science, and he lived a very long time. He died last year, I believe, but he lived a very long time, and he was very active. He was constantly, doing research and publishing books, and you would see him at conferences. He was a very active participant. His earliest work dates back to the 1950s. He was very interested in the dynamics of American politics. And eventually, at some point, his ideas became so influential that they really kind of figure into all of the different fields of political science. And we talk about him here in political theory as well. Specifically, we talk about him in the context of political pluralism. But as I mentioned at the outset, he's dealing with a very different type of pluralism than Berlin is dealing with. Berlin is dealing with, philosophical value pluralism, differences in terms of worldview. Dahl is dealing with different organized interests and how they represent themselves within politics. So basically, Dahl's political pluralism, he is trying to articulate what democratic institutions look like in contemporary nations. So as of, the 20th century, in contemporary advanced states that have modern governments, what do democratic institutions look like? And he's attending to some problems here, some challenges inherent in modern democracy, and trying to figure out ways that contemporary institutions do and can deal with those problems. The first problem is what we call the problem of large scale. The problem of large scale, it really relates to the size and scope of modern societies and the institutions that you create to make decisions for those societies. So, in ancient city-states, it might have been the case that you could have had direct democracy. They were small enough, the scope of the issues that they were dealing with was narrow enough that it is not inconceivable to think that everyone could get together in some sort of public forum and have conversations about, what the decision should be. Same thing with, I don't know, if you live in some sort of communal society, right? Say that, you and 30 of your friends buy a chunk of land and you all put houses there and you decide that you are going to rule that little community by principles of direct democracy. You could probably do so. It would be very, very hard to apply those same principles and that same commitment to direct democracy to the modern state of Germany or the United States. They're just too large. So any society is going to have organized interests, and it's going to have some set of institutions that try to push those organized interests, into settings in which you can actually arrive at outcomes. And Dahl is going to have to grapple with that. We're also dealing with the diversity that we see in terms of identities and interests in modern society. So modern societies through immigration, through colonial history, through just kind of societies developing and growing have become incredibly, incredibly diverse. There's more human mobility at this point, just in terms of volume in the world than there ever has been at any point in human history in terms of overall volume. There have been periods earlier in history, like early 20th century, where as a percentage of world population, there were more people who were mobile, but we're seeing just enormous, enormous diversity, and it's not slowing down, right? So how do we deal with that fact that there's so many different identities and there's just this kind of this enormous array of interests that we have to involve in the process in modern society? And then lastly, the problem of organized interests themselves. By the time Dahl was writing his work on this question of pluralism, we were starting to see the modern professionalization of interests. So, interests maybe at previous points in human history were kind of grassroots. They sprung up. They were potentially a little bit disorganized. By the 20th century, we're seeing interests become really, really powerful, professionalized, well-funded, well-organized political actors that have potentially have tremendous power in American politics. And so how do you take, all of those modern business groups and lobbying groups and advocacy groups and all of the different players in contemporary American politics who have really figured out how to use the system and how to do so effectively? How do you take them and organize them in some way that is ultimately beneficial? Now, I'll ask you to think here about the thinkers that we've read previously and their thoughts on organized interests. Think back to some of the other pieces that you've read for this class, and people have been talking about organized interests and factions, and what do they say about the role of organized interests in democracy? Well, we get kind of a mixed bag. We have some people who are deeply, deeply fearful of organized interests. You could have, a Rousseau who says that as soon as you have organized interests that diverge from the larger will of the community, you're in real trouble. Madison thought that the principal role of government was to regulate and control and kind of temper factions in a democratic system. So we see a lot of fearfulness, at least in some circles, about the role of organized interest and the role of factions in democracy. There's a little bit of this in Dahl, right? But largely what you'll see is that he has a pretty positive view about how these organizations can be utilized. Dahl says that independent organizations exist in all democratic countries. Consequently, the problem of democratic pluralism is a universal problem in modern democracy. In large political systems, independent organizations help to prevent domination and to create mutual control. Independent organizations help to curb hierarchy and domination. So when you have lots of independent organizations that are separate from the government, then that is actually a positive force. That can ensure that you have kind of a vigorous, robust democracy and actually prevent domination either by the state or by powerful actors within society, provided that there's this realm in which independent organizations are active in political systems. Okay, so he largely sees interest as a positive force for pluralism and ultimately for democracy. And he's responding to some critiques there, largely critiques from, we call them the Italian elite theorists, people like Gaetano Mosca, Robert Michels, who are saying that really democracy is a cover for elites. You know, the institutional framework of democracy may appear to be inclusive and appear to take into account the interests of individuals, but really what we're seeing is elites. It's an elite-driven process with some sort of democratic veneer. And Dahl is saying, no, not so fast. Democracy, it can become that, but organized interests are a force which can prevent that. It can prevent that elite-led top-down structure. He's also responding to the critiques of Marxists, who are going to look at any democratic system and zero in on economic power. And many Marxists looked at the American democratic system and said, oh yeah, this is a democracy in name only. In reality, there's tremendous influence that is tied to economic power, right? So elites, really the elites that they would be looking at are not institutional elites, but economic elites and the power that they wield. And Dahl, again, sees these independent interests and independent organizations as a basis through which you can challenge economic power. So he's responding to some critiques there. Political pluralism for him, there's 4 components to his argument that independent organizations actually strengthen democracy. The first, and I always think of Madison when he says this, Madison talking about how you can't get rid of factions. All you can really do is try to ensure that the factions are set up in such a way that there's no single overarching power, no single group, no single entity that has all of that power. So Dahl believes that independent organizations can strengthen democracy if they're fragmented. There's no single group, no single organization that's dominant. Power is divided. So in that instance, think of like any important political issue. Think of the environment, or think of education. There's really rarely any issue that you could point to in which there's a single group that is kind of the dominant group or organization. Even with the environment, I mean, there are hundreds of environmental organizations, probably thousands of environmental organizations in the United States, all with different, sometimes slightly different, sometimes radically different perspectives on that issue, all oftentimes zeroing in on some specific aspect of that issue. There are climate change organizations, there are pollution organizations, there are land conservation organizations, animal rights organizations, right? So there's no single group that speaks for the environmental movement or the environmental lobby. Power is divided, right? And Dahl would say that's good. If groups are fragmented and no single organization is dominant, then that's positive. That's representative of a diverse and robust pluralist democracy. Bargaining. Independent organizations bargain for influence, and the government acts as referee. So the independent organizations have direct connections to the government, and they are bargaining for influence, and the government as a whole, as an institution, acts as the referee for that bargaining process. Right? That's another important aspect of how these independent organizations strengthen democracy. Compromise. The result of that competition is compromise. No single group, no single independent organization is going to get everything that they want. They're going to get some of what they want. And some other group is going to get some of what they want. And some other group is going to get some of what they want. So there's no dominant single actor that walks away from any policy debate, any debate over resources, debate over funding, and gets everything that they want. If there was, Dahl would look at that and say, that's a bad thing. That organization, that interest has too much power, and they're winning too handily, and so we have to really closely scrutinize the system, because that implies that democracy and the government as a mediator is not really working the way that it should be. And the last element is consensus. And this one is tricky, because when we think of consensus, we think of agreement. And Dahl is referring to agreement, but he's not referring to what we call substantive agreement. He's referring to a sort of procedural agreement. So these groups that participate in democracy, these independent organizations, are never going to agree on the substance. You know, the NRA and the whole confluence of gun control groups that have emerged in the United States are never going to agree on the substance of what our gun laws ought to be. But the hope is that even these two groups with very different perspectives on the substance of policy agree on the underlying process, what we call the rules of the game, right? So no one is going to try to sidestep them. No one is going to say that the system is rigged and the system is unfair. They recognize that there is an institutional framework for trying to achieve what they want. And even if they don't get what they want all of the time, they still accept and feel legitimate the rules of the game, that underlying process. Okay? So you can have enormous diversity. You can have lots of independent organizations of varying strengths and varying power and influence. But as long as you have these four things, then you're good, right? Those independent organizations are a positive force for political pluralism, according to Dahl. He lays out this system in terms of how you translate different interests in society. He lays this out in a model that he calls polyarchy, basically saying that no political system is ever going to be perfect in terms of inclusion and representativeness, but you can have something that approximates that and is legitimate, and that's what he calls polyarchy. So basically, think of a 2x2 table, an X and a Y axis. On the Y axis is opportunities for inclusion. On the X axis is opportunities for inclusion. On the Y axis is representativeness, right? And he says that ideally you have something that is competitive in terms of representativeness. It makes sense for organized interests to try, because there's a chance that the political system might actually represent their interests. And there are lots of little areas for input. There are lots of little areas in which they potentially can have a say. And so you look at those two things, which from democracy to democracy are going to look very different. There's all sorts of institutional factors that could influence that, right? And a parliamentary system is going to look different than a presidential system. A unitary system is going to look different than a federal system. But in general, just think about any political system and its degree of representativeness and the opportunities for inclusion. If you have low representativeness and low levels of inclusion, Dahl is going to say, then you have some sort of autocracy, basically an authoritarian regime. If you have a very representative system, but not lots of areas for inclusion, then Dahl is going to say that you have a competitive oligarchy, right? There are ways to influence the system and to be represented, but there are very few outlets for you to do so. So of those who gain access, there's tremendous representativeness, but there are very few outlets for access. We could imagine a system in which there are lots of areas for input, but the system doesn't represent those inputs very well. So you have lots of organized interests that have access to the system, but the political system doesn't actually represent their views. And Dahl would say that's an inclusive hegemony. So there are areas for inclusion, but policy is not necessarily going to represent those interests. And he says the ideal is really this upper left quadrant, polyarchy. It won't be fully inclusive. It can't. That's going back to the problem of large scale. You can't have every organized interest represented in a political system. And it won't be fully representative, right? You won't have every demand, every platform and policy plank of every organization is going to be represented in terms of outcomes, but it'll be pretty good. So Dahl is basically accepting that polyarchy is a compromised version of democracy, that it's attuned to those issues we addressed at the outset: enormous diversity, the problem of large scale, and the degree of kind of professionalization among organized interests. So a thing to think about is if independent organizations are the key actors shaping political participation, what does this mean for the ideal of democracy? If we accept Dahl's view that independent organizations are essential, this is really the primary way that political participation happens in modern democracy, what does that mean for the ideal of democracy? So again, this is something that we would have discussed a little bit more in class. What I would have pushed you to try to understand is that this is a step away from some of the ideals in which democracy means active involvement of the demos, of the people, right? This is a more modern, a more kind of diluted conception of democracy. But from the perspective of Dahl, he would say it has to be. Those ideas of, democracy means that people actively participate and everyone is involved. He says, that's just not realistic for most modern democracies. They can't do that. But what they can do, what individual citizens can do, is connect with independent organizations that represent their interests and reward those independent organizations that represent their interests really well. And so that's really what democracy looks like in our day and age. You're not necessarily going to participate directly in the political system, but you'll support an organization that represents your interests, and then they will work to represent your interest in the political system. So representation happens not only through your representative officials, the elected officials, but it happens through these representative organizations. Individual citizens are a couple steps removed from the actual business of democracy, which for some is an unacceptable departure from their ideal of democracy. For others who are more realist in their orientation, they'll say, yeah, that's just the way it works. That's the best system that we can have given how large and complex our society is. So there are some critiques of this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the critiques, and then I'll talk about some of the ways that Dahl's perspective evolved over time and some of his later writing, which I think grapples with some of these fears and critiques. So there were a variety of observers from different perspectives who critiqued Dahl. Basically, the key critique of Dahl is these individuals see him as justifying what they view to be an undemocratic status quo. Those, viewing independent organizations as the substance of democracy as opposed to citizens really didn't sit well with lots of individuals, particularly given how, granted he's writing in the 1960s and 1970s, the growing ability of organized interest from this perspective, from the critic's perspective, to subvert democracy. They're looking at the rise of lobbying, the rise of professional political organizations, and they're saying these organizations don't represent the people in any meaningful sense. They represent themselves. They have a set of interests and an agenda all their own, and they're really not representative to individual citizens. And so this, ultimately, if we're celebrating these organizations as the basis of democracy, we're celebrating democracy being subverted. So Dahl's early work in a lot of ways was characterized by that faith in independent organizations to do the work of democracy and of these well-organized minorities, right? Because these organizations are going to be minorities. They're not going to be super inclusive. A lot of this work is going to be done by elites. He believes that these organizations can prevent domination. He did later work with an economist named Charles Lindblom. That's actually, I think, the wrong title of the book. I believe the title of the book in 1976 is Politics and the Market. Politics and Markets. And it takes a really different view. So he evolved in his thinking over time. And if you read early Dahl versus like later Dahl, very, very different. So this work in 1976 recognized that vastly unequal distribution of wealth linked with mechanisms of political power can skew the process of pluralism and overrepresent certain actors. So already he's starting to kind of look at some of these independent organizations a little bit more skeptically, and he recognizes that these organizations can just be the tools of those who are extremely wealthy and extremely powerful to advance their own interests. And his fear is that these independent organizations and interests can potentially work to overturn the rules of the game and hinder the government's ability to play the role of referee. So thinking forward, a decade or two, Dahl would be really, really nervous about some of these independent organizations. Their key plank, the key objective of these organizations is to decrease the role of government in everyday life and to deregulate, to have fewer and fewer realms in which the government has regulatory authority over individuals, over businesses, corporations, right, economic enterprises. If these organizations set out to diminish the government's ability to the point where they can no longer play the role of referee, then that's potentially dangerous, according to Dahl. So in a way, it's almost Dahl critiquing Dahl, later Dahl critiquing earlier Dahl. This is from Dahl Lindblom's book in 1976. They say that to democratize the American polyarchy further will require a redistribution of wealth and income. So they're already at this point recognizing that wealth has become skewed to such a point that the polyarchy and those organized interests are not representing equally all of the different cross sections of the United States in terms of socioeconomic status and class. Another quote from Dahl and Lindblom. He says, because governments respond more to the better off than to the worse off, they help to sustain the cycles of political effectiveness and intellectuality that in turn perpetuate the structures of inequalities. So they recognize that the government could become a tool of the more wealthy, the economically better off, to advance their own interests. Right. All right, so one last quote from Dahl and Lindblom. They say that in the United States, more money, energy, and organizational strength is thrown into obstructing equality than into achieving it, more into constraining our liberties than into enlarging them, and more into maintaining the corporate domain as a private reserve than into making its acts public. So even, shortly after Dahl is laying out this conception of pluralism and the potentially positive role of organized interest, he's already recognized that if wealthy interests and kind of the business class, the large corporate business class, is able to harness and kind of dominate that organizational realm of pluralism, then they can use it to do things that are pretty destructive for the more general public. And here, this in a lot of ways it mirrors some of the things that people are saying about the role of money in politics today. And he's saying it in 1976. He already recognized that money was translating into political power, and our set of institutions was enabling this in such a way that it could be very, very dangerous for the citizenry at large. So I put that out there just so that you get kind of a sense of the way that Dahl evolved over time. And if you look at his conception of how pluralism and organized interest in American politics works, and it seems unsatisfactory, that Dahl's later work recognizes some of the ways in which perhaps his conception of institutional political pluralism was unsatisfactory, and he accounted for that, particularly in terms of economic inequalities. I will also note that Dahl and Lindblom, I don't know of another instance of this happening, but this work that they came out with in 1976 that was beginning to highlight some of the dangers of American corporate power, ExxonMobil actually took out a full-page ad in the New York Times critiquing this book because they recognized that Dahl was very influential, and here he was essentially pulling the curtain back on what I think is now clear was the strategy at that time, as to how do we find ways in which to take this enormous wealth that we have and translate it more directly into political power. So it was really, really important that folks like Dahl and Lindblom be discredited in the American court of public opinion. So it's hard to imagine a situation today. Maybe this is just a statement of how marginalized political science is in terms of influencing the broader public discourse. But it's hard to imagine, an academic writes a book for academics, and all of a sudden, Mobil and Exxon are taking out a full-page ad to discredit that person in a very public way. So there was definitely some concern about these types of statements at the time that he was making them. So that wraps up the discussion of pluralist democracy. For next time, in which we'll be meeting in the classroom, we're taking on a very different perspective, participatory democracy, which, as I said, participatory democracy, it relies upon a more active role for the citizenry, right? And is going to be somewhat distrustful of the representative institutions that tend to dominate most contemporary democratic societies. So we start with some selections from John Dewey. Dewey, you probably have heard of at some point. Dewey was not only a philosopher and an intellectual, but he was also an educational reformer. And so a lot of the contemporary things that you do in terms of like service learning or community engagement, these efforts that try to blend working in the community and providing some tangible benefit to your community with the overall educational process, have their intellectual roots in the work of John Dewey. John Dewey also wrote quite a bit about democracy and his ideal of democracy, and he very much favored a participatory active democracy in which individuals were directly involved in decision making. So as you read this piece by Dewey, think about how he would respond to some of the democratic theories that we've covered in the past few weeks, particularly the elite-led or the elite-centric democratic theories that said, basically the masses, you can't trust them, and you need to figure out ways in which they feel legitimated enough by the political process that they don't revolt against it, while simultaneously keeping them as far away from the actual decision-making process as possible. I think that Dewey would probably disagree with that pretty strenuously, but think about why he would disagree with that. How would Dewey craft a response to that sort of perspective on what democracy ought to be? So hopefully this was helpful in making sense of some of the things that you're reading about pluralism, and I'll see you guys on Thursday in the classroom. All right.